Which founder had a gigantic influence on the United States Constitution, but then refused to sign it? Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is George Mason. Now George Mason had one of the most brilliant legal minds in Virginia leading up to the American Revolution. In fact, although he wanted to stay home and didn't want to participate in public life because he was a sickly man who also happened to be a single parent of 9 children, he was so intelligent that his neighbors kept electing him to the Virginia House of Burgesses anyway. So there he went, and when the Revolution broke out, several people wrote constitutions for the state of Virginia. And the one that they chose was the one George Mason wrote. Furthermore, just as the Revolution was breaking out, George Mason wrote Virginia's Declaration of Rights. And this document became so important. First of all, Thomas Jefferson used it when he was writing the Declaration of Independence as a reference, and almost every other state used it as a guide when they wrote their own Bills of Rights. Now, because he was so brilliant, George Mason was sent to the Constitutional Convention, and it was the only time he would ever travel farther than Maryland in his entire life. And while he was there, he spent the entire summer in Philadelphia and was very influential on writing the United States Constitution. But on September 17th, 1787, when they sat down to sign that document, George Mason refused to sign the United States Constitution. He was one of only 3 people who was actually there for the signing and still refused to sign it. And when he left, he wrote a very influential pamphlet, which was titled Objections to this Constitution of Government. And his objections became the foundation for almost all Anti-Federalist arguments from there on out. In fact, the Federalist Papers were written in response to Anti-Federalist articles in New York, but those articles were based on George Mason's objections to this Constitution of Government. I want to go over some of his objections. First of all, his first sentence says, "There is no Declaration of Rights." That's how it starts. There is no Declaration of Rights, aka there is no Bill of Rights. And this would become hugely important because this was one of the main rallying cries of the Anti-Federalists, and one of the first things that the first House of Representatives did was start discussing writing a Bill of Rights. They came up with the Judiciary Act first. They had some business to get out of the way in the form of setting up a government, but then they went right into writing a Bill of Rights. And it's because so many of the so many Anti-Federalists were upset that there was no Bill of Rights, and a lot of that stems to George Mason's recommendation. He has a bunch of other things that are interesting to note. He thought the judiciary branch would make the judicial system would override all the state laws and essentially make the states worthless and eventually disappear when it came to any legalities, although that does not seem to have been true. He also didn't like the idea that there wasn't a cabinet, what he called a constitutional council. Now, George Washington would immediately create a cabinet, and we still have a cabinet today, but there is no cabinet in the Constitution. Secretaries of Treasury, of State, of the Navy, none of those are in the United States Constitution, and Mason, like many others, thought this was very strange. He has a very great quote that I want to read for you here. He thought that because there was no constitutionally provided cabinet, that the president, quote, will therefore be unsupported by proper information and advice, and will generally be directed by minions and favorites. I just thought that was a very funny quote. Not all presidents have been directed by minions and favorites. George Washington certainly wasn't, although there are certain Andrew Jacksons out there who, in a fashion, were. No offense, Andrew Jackson, but his kitchen cabinet is fairly famous. Mason also had other criticisms of the Constitution. He did not like, notably, that the vice president was... he didn't like the vice presidency at all. He actually says, he criticized that unnecessary officer, the vice president, who for want of other employment is made president of the Senate. It's like we have nothing else for the guy who's supposed to take over if the president dies to do, so we'll make him president of the Senate. He also has several other objections, and from here Mason would go on and return to private life, but again, as I said, his leaving the United States, several people left the Constitutional Convention and became Anti-Federalists, notably the men of New York, Robert Yates and John Lansing, but they left early. Most of the Anti-Federalists didn't sit there, watch all his friends sign the United States Constitution and say, I'm going to go home and write about what a terrible idea this is. So that's the life of George Mason. I hope I inspired you to look up a little bit more about him. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like. It helps me out tremendously. And if you're interested, please subscribe. I put out videos like this 5 days a week. And thank you to all my patrons who support this channel and make it possible. If you're interested in becoming a patron, check out the link below. Thank you so much, and I'll be back with another founder tomorrow.